This is the AYANEO Pocket Micro, and for some, it might be the perfect Game Boy Advance device. A quick note, this is a review sample and engineering unit sent over by AYANEO, so not everything about this device is final, and there's a couple times I'll mention some items that they don't want us to put a final opinion on as we go throughout the review. Heading straight into the unboxing, we have the device here. They always have some premium packaging going on. Underneath that, we've got a little packet that has a couple operating manuals and user guides for the device. And finally, who doesn't need yet another USB-C cable in their connection? Personally, I never even bother taking these out anymore because I have so many, but it's always nice to see a high quality cable included. Taking a quick look at pricing, we can see that it starts at $190 on the current Indiegogo early bird pricing, up to $260 for the currently available price for the limited edition Retro. As far as what's under the hood, we have the Helio G99 powering the device and either 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM depending on the config you pick, and I'll put the rest of the specs up on the screen here if you want to dive into the details. AYANEO did graciously send over this engineering sample for review, but all opinions contained are my own. They're not seeing this video before publishing. Across the top of the device, we've got the L1 and R2 buttons, the exhaust vent power LED, power button / fingerprint sensor, the volume rocker, and the R1 and R2 buttons, which are one piece of plastic but with two different actuation points, and we'll talk about that more later. On the bottom, we've got our speakers, our USB-C port for the device, no headphone jack. We've got the AYANEO buttons, the start and select buttons, and the right speaker as well along the bottom edge of the device. On the left, we have the micro SD card slot, which is covered by a nice little rubber flap and is neatly recessed inside the metal frame. On the right, we've got the buttons which function as a home / guide button, as well as the RC, which is typically mapped to back in Android. On the back, we have the intake for the fan, as well as the 4-axis screws to pop off the back to see the internals, which we'll take a look at a little bit later in this video. Overall, a nice compact little package with a pretty premium feel, and we'll talk a little bit more about the feel as we get into it. All right, guys, buckle up. So, this device has a USB port that does not work for anything besides charging unless you turn off the controller, which is just like the Pocket Air. Perhaps this is a MediaTek chipset limitation. But what is really a bummer here is at least the Pocket Air had a 3.5mm headphone jack so that you could listen to your headphones while you're plugged in or something like that, or while using the controller on the device. But here, if you try to plug in your USB headphones, guess what? There won't be any sound out of your USB headphones unless you turn off the controller built into the device. And there's no 3.5mm headphone jack. So what does that mean? You literally cannot use headphones with this device, full stop, period, unless they are Bluetooth wireless, which is a big miss for me because when I'm gaming, I do not like hearing that latency. The device features an all-glass front as well as a metal mid-frame and a plastic back cover. Overall has a very nice feel to it and was surprisingly a lot lighter than I was expecting. One of the first things when I unboxed this I noticed was just how light it did feel in my hands. The back plastic is probably the least premium part, but still feels nice overall. The front is a little bit of a fingerprint magnet, although more of a dust magnet than anything. I didn't have too much issue with fingerprints, although you will see me wipe the device down a few times throughout the video trying to keep it clean, which is, a little bit of a compromise with these kinds of devices. All right, let's jump into testing out all of the buttons and inputs on the device that it has to offer. Starting at the top, we have our bumpers and trigger buttons. They are sort of an inline design with the outside being the L1 and R1 and the inside being the L2 and R2 trigger. But if you see in the video here, as I push towards the middle, you can actually kind of get both by pressing lightly and then harder to get the R2 and L2 function. Now, if you press all the way on the edge, that's not an issue. Or if you press all the way on the center, that's not an issue. It's just something to be cognizant of when you place your fingers on the device to make sure you're actuating the right button. Got the start and select over on the bottom left here. Again, I'm not usually a big fan of this, but I see what they're going with the design of the device here, trying to keep it slim. We've got the mode guide button /home, as well as the back button labeled RC on this device. As you can see, it's navigating back through the menu interface. Moving over to the face buttons, I think this is definitely one of the better parts of this device. AYANEO's kind of been nailing it on face buttons for me personally, at least recently, Pocket S, as well as the Micro here. They have a nice soft membrane touch. They're not too loud. They feel satisfying and are pretty accurate. Nice little rounded edge, so they don't feel bad at all to use. My caliper batteries are dying here, so it might be a little hard to see on the screen, but it's about 7.25 millimeters for the width of the button. So they are a little bit on the smaller side, but not as small as something like, say, the RG28XX, but of course not as big as an Xbox button. Really no complaints though, they do feel pretty good. The joysticks here are small. They are slightly smaller than Switch size on the tops, though the range of motion does feel at least as good as a Switch stick. In my experimentation, they seemed maybe even a little bit more accurate than the Switch sticks used on other Android AYANEO devices such as the Pocket S or the Pocket Air, and we'll get a little bit more in depth on the testing here. As you can see, they have a nice circular output here. Didn't experience any cardinal snapping or any other weird things. Was able to get pretty precise input. You can see on screen that there's a fairly large dead zone by default, though we can turn that off with the range adjustment key on the side menu. So here I'm going to turn off the range adjustment, which is essentially another word for dead zone in the AYANEO book of plays. And you'll see here now that I no longer have that dead zone area. Trying to see if the sticks recenter well, and they do seem to snap back pretty nicely. I'd say they do actually recenter better than the Pocket S. I know there's been lots of complaints on the Pocket S about when that dead zone is off, it's hard to get the sticks perfectly in the center. Sometimes requires calibration a few different times, but you can see here that it is pretty good overall and not really having any issue with the stick becoming decentered while moving it around. Just like with the Pocket S, I can't say I really understand the 50% sensitivity setting, as it just gives us this little square. Wish we had some more granularity in curves and sensitivity settings, but I do think that the extra sensitivity setting is better here than it was on the Pocket S. Even though we get that full square range, it does seem the whole throw of the stick is used. On the Pocket S, I feel like it maxed out before you reached the outer rim, but here it seems to be more well used. So if there is a situation where you need a square output, then it is certainly available. Here's a comparison with a standard Switch style stick. You can see that the top is a little bit narrower, though overall they are within the same realm of size. Since some were wondering, yes, you can pop the stick tops off on this, although you still have a little bit of that nub protruding, so it doesn't exactly make it more pocketable per se. Maybe a little bit more. I would worry about maybe debris getting in there. Perhaps a community member will come up with a cap or something that can be put over there, some sort of plug. Overlaying the top of the sticks here, you can see that the Switch has just a bit larger radius. Moving over to the D-pad, again, this is one of the highlights of the inputs of the device, along with the face buttons, which I think both these things are really important. If you're playing games that don't necessarily need shoulders or joysticks, earlier 16-bit stuff, then the inputs do really shine so far on this device. D-pad could maybe be a little bit more raised, and I think that's something they had mentioned they might be looking to do, or at least that's some feedback that Stubbs had provided. But overall it feels good. I'm not really having any issues hitting false diagonals, but when I do want to hit the diagonals and roll the D-pad, I am hitting what I need to do. So I really have not a whole lot of complaints there at all about the D-pad on this device. One of the better D-pads I've tested recently. All right, something else I know a lot of people were thinking about with this device is the ergonomics in how it looks kind of like a little miniature brick. But the fact that the corners are a little bit rounded, or at least the edges are, and the fact that it is relatively lightweight, it's not terrible to hold. If you're playing a game that needs a lot of shoulder buttons, either the triggers or the bumpers, then it might get a little bit more uncomfortable to hold. Since I originally recorded this clip, I have played a little bit longer sessions, and it's actually not that bad, but definitely preferable for games that aren't making heavy use of the shoulder buttons. All right, so it's pretty hard to get an idea for the size of this thing just by looking at some pictures of it alone. So here it is against the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. It is a good deal smaller. I was actually surprised it is smaller than I was expecting, and without the shoulder humps, it is definitely a bit of a thinner profile, even though it is fairly thick compared to its size. Next up, we've got the RG28XX, a truly small device. And what shocked me here is how it's really just wider or longer, but not a lot taller or thicker than the 28XX. Compared to my iPhone 15 Pro Max, it is obviously thicker, but it is about the same overall length, and I thought that might be a good comparison for something that might be in your pocket right now. Got the 8-bit Do SN30 Pro, the Funkey S, which is truly micro, and lastly we have the Gameboy DMG, the good old chunky boy from my childhood that I grew up with, and kind of fun to see that these both have that Nintendo reminiscent styling going on. I mean, duh, it's a Nintendo Game Boy. What am I even saying? All right, Stubbs, cover your eyes. I am going to tear down your engineering sample of the AYANEO Pocket Micro. Simply held by 4 hex head screws. Of course, I didn't have the right size tip for my fix-it screwdriver, so I had to go with a good old-fashioned Allen wrench here to get them off. All right, so I'm trying unsuccessfully to use a pry tool. There's really nowhere to get in there, and it's nice and secure, so I think we're gonna have to attack this from another angle. Yes, I have discovered the handy-dandy suction cup out of my small electronics toolkit, and that is what we need to get the job done. There are some fairly strong clips, so gently pull this up with the suction cup, and once you've got the cup on there, you may want to use a plastic tool to kind of pry along the edge and get the remaining clips undone. Be very careful, as this metal frame probably scratches pretty easily. Definitely recommend using only plastic tools for this part. Be really careful. There is an antenna with a soldered wire here. When you're taking the back off, you cannot fully remove the back. Jerk it too hard, you're probably going to rip that connection. And here she is, laid open, a gut shot of the Pocket Micro. The vibration motor got knocked loose while opening it up, but that just pops right back into the little area down here. So there's the vibration motor. Over here we've got the micro SD card reader. We've got the cooling fan for the device with the fins up top. And battery over here. Looks like it would be pretty easy to replace if you did need to replace the battery. And left and right speakers are these narrow little devices on the sides here. Battery seems glued in or something like that, so I'm not going to rip that apart right now. I think this is about as deep as I'm going to go. Gives you a nice clear view of the internals, but as this is on loan from Stubbs, I do not want to tear it apart too far, but at least you get an idea of how the insides are laid out here. One quick note: when you're taking it apart and putting it back together, these little rubber gaskets for the joysticks fall off easily, so make sure you keep track of those and pop them back on before you pop the joystick caps back on if you do take those off. I took them off just while disassembling to make it a little easier to lay flat. Oh look, cleaning off the screen from dust yet again. Interesting. Now let's take a look at the screen on this device. It has a 960 by 640 resolution, which is 3.5 inches in a 3:2 aspect ratio. It is a very crisp resolution. We don't see this high resolution on these smaller screen devices a whole lot. This does look a significant step up from the usual 640 by 480 you might find on a small device. And in fact, a lot of the 3:2 devices have an even lower resolution. Compared here against the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you can see it does look like the AYANEO Pocket Micro has a bit better contrast and blacks. And of course, they're not using a after the fact calibration like this Retroid unit is using to combat the tint. Let's turn off the lights here to get a little better look at what the screen contrast looks like versus the black device. You can maybe see, if you're looking closely at this video, that it is a little bit lighter. Of course, it is an IPS panel, but it maintains really nice contrast, vivid colors, and crisp motion clarity throughout its display for an IPS. Putting this through an artificial torture test here, here's an all-white screen with the camera exposed just right to see it when it's at max brightness. On the Pocket S, we saw that dim right edge on the screen, so I wanted to test for that. Thankfully, I do not see any weird vignetting issues whatsoever. And then we'll switch over to a dark environment here to see if we can see any bleeding on the screen. And we see just a hair on the right side of the screen by the Y button there. There's a slight light spot, as well as on the bottom right and the left. But man, I am really trying hard to find these. I think you would see this on almost every single handheld. This is truly a torture test. Under a regular viewing environment, the light bleed is not noticeable at all. Here's a 240 frame per second clip slowed down. so you can see a little bit of what the motion clarity looks like on the screen. As you can see, there's not too much ghosting going on, so overall it's a pretty good screen in terms of motion. Nothing like what I saw on the Odin 2. Don't hate me. So AYANEO does have their IS-based launcher, which is supposed to be able to input data from other launchers. Here I am trying to get it to work with the Emulation Station Desktop Edition format. It says it's importing the game data. It does say it's successful. You can see here that we do have the systems listed, and when I pop into one, you can see the games, but unfortunately none of the metadata or thumbnails did carry over. I've played around with this a little bit on the Pocket S, and it is possible to get that stuff showing up. It requires some renaming of files. So I'm still hoping that AYANEO improves the ability to import your existing collection or some sort of automatic scraping. Right now I don't really want to dive into the time it's going to take to sort and scrape all the art within IS Space. Over on the Android gaming side, I tried to run Dead Cells, and unfortunately once it gets to menu, this just freezes up and then ultimately quits back to the launcher. I tried it a few different times in different settings and could not get it to work. Stardew Valley, however, works just perfectly fine, so if you've ever wanted to farm in a micro portable format, this might be the device for you. You see here I'm at the beginning. I've played most of my Stardew Valley time on the PC, though this is not necessarily my favorite game. But yeah, runs well, so if you're a Stardew fan, maybe this is the perfect premium Stardew device for you. Nice and crisp, good colors on the screen, an enjoyable experience. Showed this off in my Pocket S video. Grim Valor is a fun Android game that supports controls, hack and slash that I like to play. Good little test of using native controller input on Android. And this game isn't exactly a graphical showcase, although it still looks nice, so no problems running it here on the Pocket Micro, and overall a pretty pleasant experience. Moving on to one of the heavy hitters on Android, we have Genshin Impact. Of course, since we are on Android and not iOS, we do not get native controller support, but you can see here that it is running okay, by default locked at that 30 FPS cap, and we'll play around a little bit with the different performance settings. This is a good opportunity to show off the key mapping. We'll toggle that on and click the key mapping link. Over on the top left here, you've got a add mapping point button, after we dismiss the tutorial here at least. So you just click over on add mapping point, then you can hit expand to see all the buttons. Apologize for the camera focus issues here. Select the button that you'd like to map. In this case, we'll do the right stick, and we'll just drag it over to where it needs to go. And we'll progress through mapping most of the general inputs on this game so we can show you that off, and I'll fast forward that real quick here. All right, you can see here after some mapping and some tweaks, we have controller input working via on-screen mapping with Genshin Impact, and not really feeling any issues or lag or anything like that. So overall, it is a treat to have built-in input mapping, and I don't have to rely on an external app like you might with a GameSir controller or using the Mantis Pro app, which I use a lot of times on unsupported controllers, but nice that it's all built in here, so can't complain about that at all. Testing out some performance modes, I'm going to bump this up to the game. Previously we were on the balanced power profile, and see how that runs. Let's try to put this on 60 FPS here and see if that works. The game's going to complain that it's too demanding, but we'll see. And nope, unfortunately we cannot maintain a solid 60 here on low settings. We're getting about 40, 44, 50 frames per second, and this is just in a wide open area, so that might get worse in an intense scene. So let's pop this back down to 30 frames per second cap, as I think that's going to be more appropriate for this device. But let's try changing the render resolution and see if we can still maintain 30 frames per second. Hopping over to medium, it does appear that we are still maintaining our 30 frames per second, and the game does look a little bit crisper. This is probably all you really need on a screen this size. Not a whole lot of returns on cranking it up, but let's just test out a higher resolution and see if that does work. Popping this over to high, but still at a 30 frames per second cap. Let's check that out. And surprisingly, it is still maintaining that 30 frames per second. So I guess the device cannot hit 60 frames per second in Genshin Impact, but does maintain 30 reasonably well when playing at low, medium, or high resolution. Didn't dive into a lot of the other settings, as I'm sure once we start turning more stuff up, it will start to slow down a little bit. But overall, it still looks pretty great and perfectly playable. So if you've been looking for the ultimate mini Android device to play Genshin or other Android games on, then perhaps this is a good choice for you. And unfortunately, Star Wars Hunters just gives us a message that the device is incompatible. I'm assuming this is hard-coded, so maybe that's something that developers of this game can update, or maybe we can use spoofing. As far as retro emulation goes, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the systems that we know will run well here, so we can pretty safely say that up to Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast era, there are no issues running any games on here. Now, keeping in mind that integer scaling is, to me, not a huge deal on this system, since it is such a high PPI that the kinds of aliasing artifacts you might see in a lower resolution display aren't really present here unless you're really up on top of it. I personally don't see a huge difference between integer and non-integer scaled on the screen, since it is just so high resolution. Moving on up to PSP, I think this is a pretty cool system to play on here. It might be a little bit small, but since it's 3.2, you do get a little bit better of a display area than your typical 3.5-inch 4.3 handheld, and it definitely has the power here to handle a 2x scale, which is conveniently the same as the width of the pixels on this screen here. I was even able to bump it up to 3x for some titles, but with some titles at 4x, it started to slow down a little bit, but there's really no reason to run it that high, as at that point it's double the resolution of the screen here. Moving up to where the performance starts to falter a little bit, we're going to take a quick look at GameCube. Here is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. I had somewhat inconsistent results in one of my sessions. It seemed to run perfectly fine at 2 to 3x, and one of them it didn't quite run perfectly, but did okay at 1x. So just keep in mind that with GameCube, you're looking at about 1 to 2x resolution on the games you're playing, and it may be hit or miss, though there is a decent amount of playable games. Of course, the heavy hitters here, like F-Zero, as you can see, it's only running at 42% speed, and that's at just the internal resolution of GameCube, no upscaling, so unfortunately you're not going to play those heavy-hitting GameCube titles on this. As far as PS2 goes, definitely going to depend on the game. On a heavier game here, like God of War, it does see some slowdowns even at 1x, but I did check out and put it on a 1-cycle skip, and it did improve the God of War performance a little bit to be mostly playable. Again, though, this is just the intro scenes of the game, so I can't speak to the entirety of the game. I did a very brief test on the emulator that shall not be named, and suffice to say that this is a medium lightweight 3D title here, and I'm not quite pulling off a smooth frame rate on here, but it is technically playable, and I imagine some lighter weight 2D games will play okay, but for 3D games, might be expecting a little bit too much out of the system. And now let's head to the wrap. Oh wait a second. You guys didn't actually think I was going to skip Game Boy Advance, did you? No, in fact, GBA is so great on this system that it deserves its own section of the video. With this crisp, vivid screen being an exact 4x ratio of Game Boy Advance, it really is maybe the premium handheld if you want to play Game Boy Advance. If Game Boy Advance catalog is your jam, you love playing the games on there, and other games are secondary to you, then this is probably the best device you can get if you are willing to pay the $190 plus price tag on it. Because we do have 4x and not just 1x or 2x scaling here, it also leaves a lot of room for pixel shaders. I'm going to show off here first the LCD Grid V2 shader, which is a bit more of a true to life type shader that shows even the RGB subpixel kind of layout there and stuff like that, which is kind of cool. If you want a bit more of an authentic feeling gameplay, you can definitely slap that on. This other one here I use sometimes is a more conservative grid shader, which just gives you the lines but not necessarily the LCD pixel effects, so it kind of gives you a bit of that nostalgia vibe while still keeping it a little bit modern. And I think this is one of my favorite ways to play it because it gives it a little bit of that charm, but you're still reaping the benefits of the modern hardware and display. Even though they might not be true to life, I'm not personally a big fan of the color palette changing filters. Yeah, they might look like original Game Boy Advance, but there's a reason I'm playing Game Boy Advance on this and not an actual Game Boy Advance, because I do like those modern quality of life features. Alright, with that out of the way, it is time to wrap up the video. Today I am not going to do the traditional pros and cons that I do on my other reviews, because this is a pre-production, it is an engineering sample, so it's not final, and I don't want to give a concrete opinion on it based on something that may have changes before launch. That being said, I think that overall it is a pretty cool system. I actually liked it more than I thought I was going to. This isn't necessarily one of the releases that I was really chomping at the bit to get to, but I do think that the premium feel, and it feels a lot lighter than I was expecting to, so it is pretty nice to hold. Not as uncomfortable as you might think that it would be. I know people are saying, it's square, it's going to be super uncomfortable. Who wants to hold a brick like that? But really, it's fine. It's pretty comfortable. You are limited a little bit by the battery life as well. You know, I did a test about 2.5 hours running PS2 at max performance. So that's kind of worst case scenario, maybe even slightly underneath that, depending on just how hard you're pushing it. But I think you'll get definitely more than that playing the other retro systems. So maybe you're not going to be playing it for a long enough session to really care about the ergonomics that much. Anyway, the face buttons and the D-pad are grade A for me on this. Really enjoy them. There could be some minor tweaks that they make to improve them, but I have really no complaints. Actually kind of enjoy the D-pad quite a lot. The sticks don't really have that much more range than a standard Switch stick, but they do feel pretty good to use. I was happy with them overall. A little bit on the small side, but I think on a system like this, they're kind of secondary. You know, some might wish that this system just didn't have a stick at all or one stick, and I could see an argument for that, but it is capable of playing some of that PS1, Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, so there is a reason to have the sticks around. Audio is not necessarily the best ever, but that is one of the things in the review guide that they said is not final, so I didn't actually include an audio section here. We'll wait for the final unit to really comment on that. Man, my biggest beef is the fact that there's no headphone jack and that the USB port can't be used for audio at the same time as the inbuilt controller on the device is working. That's a huge miss. I'm hoping that's something they can fix through software, but I've got a sneaky suspicion it's not, because that's how the Pocket Air functioned, as some limitation of the way that chipset was set up on the board. Overall, if you're going to play GameCube, PS2 primarily, then no, I wouldn't say that this is your main device, because there are some compromises and trade-offs there, though in a pinch it can run a decent chunk of those catalogs. PSP, it's pretty good actually if you wanted something smaller than a Retroid Pocket 3 or 4 or something in that class to do PSP. And for your older 16-bit 4, 3, and 1 systems, you are losing a little bit of screen real estate compared to some of the other options out there. But because the resolution is so high and it's so crisp, it actually makes those systems look really great, and you really have a big capacity to use shaders for those. So it's not a terrible way to enjoy those, as long as you're okay with a little bit of that screen size compromise. And of course, as I said before, Game Boy Advance, really the big selling point here. If you're a Game Boy fan, a Game Boy Advance fan, this is really going to be the device for you. It feels premium. The display is perfect for that system. Vivid, crisp, good motion, compatible with shaders. The types of buttons that you're actually going to be using on a Game Boy Advance game, the face buttons, the D-pad, and the R1 and L1 are all perfectly acceptable inputs. So it's a great system in that regard. Whether or not that's all worth $190 to $260 to you is really a personal choice. This is a bit of a niche device. It's not something that I would say it should be your first handheld or you should run out to buy if you want a general purpose. But if the things that I've talked about in this review are important to you, like the integer scaling and the face buttons and D-pad, then this could be a recommendation, especially for someone who likes to have a different handheld in their collection for each system. Excited to see if there's any other updates to the unit when it goes final. It is in a better condition already than when Stubbs reviewed it. He had some software issues. AYANEO sent us a firmware update, and I did apply that firmware update prior to this video, and a lot of the software issues that he experienced were gone. Still had Dead Cells that was crashing on me and a couple other weird issues, but overall nothing huge in terms of issues outside of the headphone thing that I had on the unit. So I think, it's pretty cool that AYANEO has entered the space and provided these premium options. The price might not make sense for a decent chunk of the population out there, but there are other handhelds that cater to those lower price points, and we've seen a lot of cool stuff come out even just recently. So yeah, premium Android, premium price, premium build quality, everything is pretty premium about it, except for the fact that there's no headphone jack. On that note, have a good day and happy gaming.